Final Fantasy XIV needs to change, but how? Let's talk about it. Hello Void, it's Eldon, and last week I talked about the history of 14 and what it needs to do in the present. The conclusion I came to summarize a 30-minute video, is that 14 needs to change. It's grown stagnant, rested for far too long, and now everything is stale. The flaws of the game are exacerbated by the length of time that they've been out in the spotlight, and the only reasonable solution is for the game to change. Before we go too deep into this topic, I'm just gonna pull over for a second and say, if you enjoy this video or any of my others, please subscribe. And also, disclaimer, this video will largely focus on very specific solutions that I have no power of implementing. The overall point is just to advocate for 14 to change. What I present here are a lot more my opinions and a fun thought exercise than me speaking objectively on what the game actually needs. So, change. As I said before, 14 needs to change. What does change really mean? Well, overall, there are a couple areas 14 really needs to switch up and change. Those are the battle system, content delivery, and social incentives. Social incentives mean the type of activities that are available and how they promote people to work together. Content delivery is the amount of content they actually produce and the type of content that makes up what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And finally, the battle system involves their core fight design and job design that exist within all activities. For the purpose of this video, I'm not going to talk too much about social incentives or content delivery. That's mostly for two reasons. One, I think social incentives are a far more intricate issue that requires a lot more thought and probably its own dedicated video. As for content delivery, the points for the previous one are also true, but also, I don't really know the state of 14's development cycle. The game has gotten much bigger with them extending the patch cycle into 4 months, and there definitely needs to be a change. However, what a reasonable change is to suggest, I don't know. And I think we're all aware that the backloading of content deeper into the expansion is a problem, but the nuances of that problem are something that still needs a little bit more examination. That leaves mostly the battle system for this video. And since that was also the focus of my analysis last week, when I looked over all of the expansions to see how the battle system has changed, I think this is the perfect opportunity to look at what 14's battle system is, why it's failing to live up to its potential, and what they can do to make it better. So let's start with that first bit. What is 14's battle system? The battle system, as I define it, combines job design and fight design to create the feel of the majority of 14's encounters. Now, this extends from a simple dungeon boss all the way up to ultimate. However, the general schema of things should follow a trend upward, meaning that the mechanics present in the simplest dungeon should eventually be remixed into more complicated versions of itself all the way up to Savage. The fight design of 14, if I were to summarize, has essentially become the survivability onion on crack. The survivability onion is a methodology for avoiding death, especially in armed conflicts. It goes like this. The outermost layer. Don't be there. In 14's case, don't stand in the damage puddle. Layer 2. Don't be detected. If it's a targeted mechanic or something you can avoid, don't be the target. Don't be acquired. If you are the target, or if it's unavoidable, don't be in a bad place and don't be unprepared for it. Don't be hit. If you're taking damage, mitigate that damage. Don't be penetrated. Don't get vuln stacks. Don't be killed. Actually, this one is straight up don't die. 14 has evolved over time to throw these kinds of checks at you rapid fire over and over. They've moved away from longer term puzzle elements that you often get in things like WoW, and instead, most of the game focuses almost entirely on making more and more complex versions of onion checks. Specifically, 14 focuses a lot on the outermost layer of the onion, on the don't be there angle. They do have some puzzle mechanics, but those are mostly relegated to things like Ultimate and Savage. Yet even those don't last the full length of the fight like other MMOs have. Instead, 14 is all about responding to mechanics in the moment, solving one puzzle at a time, and living long enough to kill the boss before it enrages and kills you. The jobs have evolved similarly to solve those issues. Each one of them has a kit of universal abilities that can solve a small number of necessary utilities like knockback immunity, mana regen, and such. But for the most part, each job's main goal is to deal DPS to end the fight. Tanks have some mitigation to survive the parts of the onion that require mitigation. Healers have enough healing to get people back up to survive the next part of the onion that requires taking damage, but those realities are pushed to the side because most of 14's design is around that outer onion, avoiding damage entirely, rather than taking the damage you get and continuing on. This is not necessarily a problem. In fact, I think it might be a feature of 14's fight design. And it is fairly unique amongst other systems like this. It's low man, high intensity rating. It focuses on individual boss fights rather than an ecosystem. It creates a very unique experience, but it's definitely not without its problems. In pursuit of this platonic ideal, of this outer onion focus, 14 has ended up unifying a lot of the jobs. Each job has been meticulously designed to work very well inside of fights they're making, but that ends up with all of them following into very similar patterns and circumstances. It also means that a lot of the support roles end up feeling like their support features are almost entirely deprioritized, making tanks and healers feel kinda just like different colored DPS, rather than the supports that their initial job fantasy promotes. To further agonize these small issues, 14 has had them for way too long, to the point where now simple solutions no longer suffice. People are done. If you want more info, check out the last video, but to summarize, the game's been the same for way too long, and now things that were just annoying have become deeply and irreparably bad. These issues are no longer normal, no longer patchable. Instead, you need to replace them entirely. 14 needs to change. The current design is not compatible with itself. We need to make more sweeping changes to right the course and set 14 back on the virtuous path. Alright, so this is the point where I have to sort of decide on something. There are two possibilities from here. One, 14 fundamentally changes their design philosophy, spreading farther along the onion and giving tanks and healers a lot more stuff to do. Or two, they change the way the jobs work to make the parts of the onion that they're playing into a lot more interesting. The biggest issue is not that either of these decisions are bad, it's just that they're two different choices, and choosing either of them sort of closes off the other, at least for the time being. Currently, the design is incompatible. The job focus is built around a wider onion design, but the fights are focused more on the outer onion, and those don't synergize well. It creates friction, and it leaves supports feeling bad. So we have to choose. And personally, I think the right choice is to keep the fight design similar to how it is. Thanks for making it halfway through the video, gang. So from this point on, I'm going to be doing mostly my opinion. There are going to be some good analysis here, but the conclusions drawn, especially when it comes to how I change the jobs, are more my idea rather than an absolute virtuous good. There are plenty of ways the game can change from here. We've successfully identified the problem, and now we just need to advocate for change. And I'm going to advocate for a specific change because that's really fun to do, and I really enjoy thinking about it. It's a good mental exercise and helps me work out my design muscles. But don't get bogged down in the details. Don't overcommit to one specific change. Enjoy the fantasy of the ideas without attributing any virtue to the actual change presented. It could have unseen consequences. It could have ripple effects that impact the entire game. And hell, even these theoretical changes could get stale after a long time like the current system has. Keep an open mind and think positively about the future. So, we are going to change 14's job design. We're going to try and make each of the jobs as they currently exist a little bit more fun in the current outer onion design focus. We're going to make jobs that respond better to the kind of environment 14 already presents. Let's start with healers. Not because healers are the simplest, far from it, but because I have an entire video talking about how I want to change healers and what they do and how they should change. To make a very long story short, healers are too good at healing most of the mechanics present in the game, and that makes them not feel like they're spending enough time healing or have any impact as a support. And so, I think the best way to change healers is to make them have a more interesting time healing the kind of damage 14 actually does. 14 focuses on this outer onion design. That means that most of the damage is group-wide small damage that doesn't kill people but is also unavoidable. There are some single target tank busters, but for the most part, the majority of the damage is being dealt to the whole party. The healers as they currently exist are way too good at dealing with that. 14's healer design is currently built around cooldown management. This means that there are a number of pretty decent buttons that are good at healing. Largely, these buttons are OGCD AoE heals. This means that when fights are dealing their common low-intensity AoE damage to everyone, the healer can solve that by pressing one of a dozen buttons on the hotbar. That means that the only time the healer is ever going to be challenged is when there's enough consistent damage output to use up all of those skills before they come back off cooldown. This means the only place where healers can feel challenged is either 1, when things are going really, really wrong, or 2, in Savage Plus content. There are 2 solutions to this. The first is to increase the amount of damage being dealt to the party, but doing so is quintessentially moving away from the outer onion design, which I think is 14's strength. It also shortens the amount of flexibility for healers, meaning that a worse healer will cause the party to wipe way more than any other job being bad. The other solution is to make healers less good at healing small, incremental AoE damage. Imagine if, instead of being able to heal the group by pressing one button, or by channeling a low-cost AoE heal skill, instead you had to expend a resource and do something like a healing combo. You'd have to interact with a more complex system than pressing one button in order to heal the most common damage in the game. That is what I would like to change in our healers. I think we need to move away from cooldown-based healing and instead move into more intricate healing systems. We need to severely limit healers' access to AoE healing and make their primary path to power on being able to achieve really strong, high-output AoE healing. If instead of being able to press 3 buttons that each heal your party 20%, you had to press 3 buttons to, at the end, heal your party 80%, that means that you are engaging in your job's core mechanic every time you have to AoE heal, which is pretty often. If we make that primary path to power, focusing on making comparatively complex AoE healing, then healers will be able to use that path to power way more often than they are doing right now. Of course, this can also come with an increase in damage being dealt during fights, especially the amount of high single target damage being dealt to non-tanks specifically. If there are mechanics that are consistently chunking one of 8 members, then healers also have to actually pay attention to their party bar. They have to be watching and respond to mechanics instead of just mashing an AoE heal button whenever any mechanic resolves. I think I also have to include a section on one particular topic here, because, well, there's not really another place to say it, and it deserves to be talked about. And that is the green DPS epidemic. Healers, as I can tell from a lot of the comments on my healer video, want to be supports. They don't want to be focusing on DPS. They want to be healing. However, in 14, a lot of the time, they're asked to deal damage. Now, I'm not going to talk about having more complex healer damage rotations here. I think that would be awesome. I think they definitely deserve that, but that's out of scope for what we're trying to talk about right now. What I want to clarify is why the game is like this. And it's not malice. It's not some conspiracy by the devs. It's probably not even that intentional. The reason that supports have to deal damage during raids is due to one factor the party size. 14 has an 8-person party with 2 healers. This means that healers dealing damage makes up for a quarter of the people in the fight. Even if healers only deal half the total damage of a DPS, then having healers deal damage still finishes the fight like an 1/8 quicker. Oh, and healers have to be able to deal somewhat comparable damage to a DPS because you're expecting people to clear the story, the actual main feature of 14, as a healer, and the story is mostly about shooting random mobs in a purple circle in the middle of the overworld, so you actually have to be able to deal some amount of damage, or else the experience of the story as a healer would feel way worse. This reality of healer DPS means that any party that is optimizing for healer damage is going to be able to surpass DPS checks much better than any party that isn't, regardless of how the fight is designed. And so, as 14 has evolved over the years, that pressure has pushed healers towards dealing more and more damage. Combine this with an outer onion design focus, it means that healers have a lot of free time, and in that free time, they're going to be DPSing. It's a natural reaction, and it's not a bad thing. DPS is fun. The problem comes when the healing doesn't feel impactful, when doing your actual job ends up feeling more like a side mission to spamming one button. I hate to say it, but healers don't actually hate DPSing. They hate not feeling like a healer, and those are not the same thing. If we change the way healers work so that healing is more relevant to the kind of damage being dealt, we can make healers more fun and feel more like supports, while keeping 14 the way it is now, with its own uniqueness intact. This is possible, so don't lose hope. With those two changes, with an increase in single target damage, as well as restricting healers' ability to do AoE healing, I think we can adapt the current healing system into one that's really fun for the jobs. In order to make healers more fun jobs, we need to make it so that they are worse at healing, so that the amount of time they have to spend being a support is increased, and the amount of focus they have to spend on doing their support skills is increased. With that, we can make healers supports again. Now let's look at DPS. Yes, we're going to talk about DPS here. Overall, I think DPS are probably the best adapted to 14's current system. And that's mostly because the goal that they want is the most in line with the way fights are actually designed. DPS want to deal damage, and the fight design focuses mostly on letting people deal damage. That means that the DPS aren't really missing anything. And since there's not too much for me to say here, well, we'll get to that. We're going to take this opportunity to focus on the 2-minute meta. The 2-minute meta was an interesting idea, in theory. People were having some issues aligning their buffs, and so they decided in Endwalker to make all the buffs align easily every 2 minutes. In practice, this has led to some very unfortunate outcomes. One is it's pushed a lot of the jobs into very similar timings. 2, it's made all the fights design a little bit more predictable. And 3, it's caused any job with a design that doesn't work well in a 2-minute burst window to be forcibly reworked, limiting the amount of unique rotations and systems present in the game. On top of that, the 2-minute meta is just kind of boring. The simplification it causes leads the game to be a lot more predictable, and that means that there's a lot less skill expression involved. Also, the timing has just gotten stale over time. The 2-minute meta has got to go, and I don't think anyone is really holding on to it. Now, how do we fix the 2-minute meta? The first option is simply to go back to a 6-minute meta, to have more complex buff alignments and have all of them coalesce every 6 minutes in line with your pot. And this is fine enough, probably the one they should go for, but, there's a more interesting way. The other thing we could do to address the 2-minute meta is to go to the root of the problem and address the prevalence of raid buffs. Raid buffs aren't really an interesting type of ability to press on their own. They're kind of boring. They serve the purpose of dictating your play pattern, the timings of your stuff, and also reward people who are cognizant of when they are up and when other people are using them. However, whenever they all line up, especially when it happens every 2 minutes, it causes a ton of swing damage. It causes instability in the amount of DPS people are doing. I started back in Shadowbringers, and there we were still in the 6-minute meta, and 14 was touted for having really good balance. However, in recent years, that pattern has fallen off, and that is mostly because of the 2-minute meta. It is harder to balance damage in the 2-minute meta because when there is so much buff stacking, the amount of damage variation in these small burst windows is far more impactful. If you get a couple bad RNG burst phases, you're dealing significantly less damage than you would otherwise. Overall, and this is me personally, I don't think party-wide raid buffs are super important. I don't think they are legitimately interesting. I don't think they provide a super fun aspect of the game, especially if we want to keep 14 with its current design of having very tight DPS checks, because somewhat counterintuitively, raid buffs hurt that goal. They're a holdover from a different time when synergy was a lot more important, but synergy between specific jobs causes problems. Having jobs that can only work together leads to some jobs being excluded from Party Finder. I think 14 is better off without raid buffs, at least not as prevalent as they are right now. Sure, we could have one big raid buff job, that's fine. But as a matter of course, most jobs should not just have a random raid buff every 2 minutes thrown in for no reason. It's not interesting for their kit and leads to problems in the game. I think we should probably still keep up a lot of the personal buffs, both buffs to yourself that help solidify when your specific damage phase is, as well as things like Damster's partner gimmick, which allows one other particular player to pop off. I think those things are really cool. They help with job identity. They keep things interesting. But the massive slate of large-scale, full-party raid buffs is way too much. Summoner should not have a random 2-minute button that makes everyone else deal 10% more damage. That just causes the game to have a lot more variation without providing much in the way of interest. If we want to solve the 2-minute meta, we need to limit raid buffs. We need to allow more space for jobs to be more interesting. Alright, now let's get to tanks. And there's a reason I saved tanks for last. Tanks are tough to fix. If we want to maintain the current system, then we want to keep this outer onion design. And what that ends up meaning is that tanks are not going to take significantly more damage. And because of that, there ends up not being too much we can do inside of a tank job's kit to make them more interesting as support. I think the only thing we can do is remember that tanks are in fact supports, that their job is a support job. They support the party by taking the brunt of the damage and surviving, and helping others when they need to take damage. Therefore, in order to change tanks and make them more interesting under the current fight design, I think the thing we want to change about a tank's kit is that we want to make them more supporty. Give tanks more party-wide damage mitigation. Currently, most tanks only have one of these abilities on a fairly long cooldown. I think realistically, the best option would give each tank an interesting way to mitigate damage for the whole party. This would make them actually be able to help more often, and if we add a system around this kind of mitigation, make them engage with their support mechanics more often as well. There's also some things to be said about position management for bosses and things like aggro. I think certainly it could be easier to lose aggro. But in all honesty, I don't think that making the enmity system significantly more complex is the right path to go. The problem with a complex enmity management system in 14 is that the party size is kinda too small. It's much more simple to keep track of who has what, and if things mess up, then you're losing 1 out of 8 players. This means that having a volatile enmity system is way more risky. It's going to mean that a bad tank is going to get their party killed a lot more frequently than any other job, and would probably drastically spike tank anxiety. Also, I don't think it'll necessarily be that fun. Losing threat is not a super fun scenario. It kind of just means the boss turns around, punches a DPS in the face, and then you press the buttons that get the aggro meter back, and you're like, oh, well, messed that up. So, yeah, I don't think we need to significantly change that. Maybe make it more volatile, I think that's fine, but that shouldn't be our main focus. If I actually were to decide on the main focus, then what I do need to do is engage in a little bit of fight redesign. I think currently, especially now in low-end content, the tank busters suck. They're not life-threatening, they're always targeting the tank, and if anything, what 14 needs is a way for tank busters to threaten DPS more often, and for tanks to be able to intercede and step in, saving individual members. Maybe we just make red tethers more frequent a mechanic, but hopefully there's a more elegant solution. What I want to see is life-threatening single-person target abilities that a tank can stop, to let tanks have the ability to step in and save individual people's life, and to make that a lot more common. There's only 8 people in the raid. It's easy to keep track of that many people, and if we let tanks have their hero moment a lot more often, then they're feeling like supports. It fits in with the outer onion design. It gives tanks a lot more things to do, and honestly, I just think it would be really cool. So, overall, I think we should combine tanks being able to have more AoE mitigation, and to make that AoE mitigation a fun thing. We should increase the volatility of the threat system, and we should change fight design to give tanks more hero moments, to let them step in and save DPS that are actually being threatened by single target mechanics. If we do all of that, hopefully tanks end up feeling more like supports and end up feeling a lot better in the outer onion focus of 14. And so that will about do it. We've covered all 3 of the different roles, talking about how we can change each of them to make them better suited to the way 14 fights are, and to make them more fun in the fight design that we have, and that we should stick with going forward. At the end of the day, I want 14 to change. I want it to make itself more suited to the ways in which it is unique, and not rest in a system that just works. I think 14 needs to evolve. I think it needs to evolve into a game that complements its own vision of what it should be. We've sanded away a lot of the rough edges from the design that we started out with. But now, I think it's time to add a little bit more interest. If Square can do that, then I'm sure 14 will begin to thrive once again. Thank you for listening to this video. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. I talk about 14 most weeks, and still have a bunch of thoughts I want to get out there. Next week, the plan is to discuss what is mid-core, and how we can have more of it. If you have any thoughts about the topic I discussed today, or any suggestions for future topics, please leave them in the comments. I really enjoy reading them. If you want to support me, then the best way to do it is to try the demo for my game. Yep, I made a game. It's called Pilgrim Unto Shadow. The demo is available on Steam right now, so check it out and see if you like it. It doesn't really have anything to do with 14, but I think it's really fun. Regardless, I still appreciate you for watching, and do remember, it's a long road out there, Void, so keep changing, and hopefully, you'll get what you're going to. Ta-ta!